My name is June Cross. I was born January 5th, 1954, in Bellevue Hospital in New York City.
Very good. And where did you grow up?
The first 5 years I grew up in New York. And then when I was in the middle of my 5th year, I moved to Atlantic City, New Jersey for complex reasons. But basically my mother was white and my father was black and they split up. Then she couldn't figure out how to raise a black child on her own in New York. She was also trying to find another guy, and she couldn't find a guy. She was white, so she couldn't find another white guy that would agree to be in a relationship with her, with me around. So she sent me to be raised by friends of the family. They weren't really even friends of the family at that point. They were the couple that had owned the apartment where my father and mother rented the basement when he played Atlantic City during the season. So in the 50s in Atlantic City, pre-casinos, you would come like on the season ran from Memorial Day to Labor Day, and you were booked for the entire summer in a club. So like Jimmy would be booked. He was part of a group called Stumpin' Stumpy. So they were booked in the Club Harlem, say, for the entire season. And so they would you would rent an apartment for the entire summer. And Peggy and Paul, Peggy and Uncle Paul, as I came to call them, owned the house where this apartment was. And I came to call them Aunt Peggy and Uncle Paul.
But
and I was raised there until I graduated high school.
Can you explain how that?
How that worked? So my mother lived in New York, and New York is like 2.5 hours from Atlantic City by the Garden State Parkway, and I would go back and forth during summer vacations. I also had an older brother who sometimes stayed with me in Atlantic City, but he was white. I often laughing at my mother's memorial, I laughingly said my mother believed that nothing should match, not even the fathers of her children, so she had 3 children, 3 different daddies. I was, then at some point she left me with Peggy. Well, I was 5. It was right before I began school, seriously. My brother at that point, he's 14 years older. He was in a foster home somewhere in upstate New York. And I stayed in Atlantic City, and I basically was raised on Peggy for all intents and purposes, although I called her Aunt Peggy. She was my mother, and my mother asked me to call her Aunt Norma when I was in New York to avoid craziness or on her side. So I lived like that until I was 45 years old. It took me that long to get, not really to get over it, but to question her. I did a documentary about all of this called Secret Daughter, which was a 2-hour documentary, so I'm not going to get into the whole thing. You're going to have to ask me what questions you want to ask me, because I could spend 2 hours just telling you about the details.
The abandonment must have...
I actually didn't feel abandoned. Children are remarkably resilient. I was actually talking to one of my high school classmates about this, he's a criminal defense attorney here in D.C. He said, you're really right. He said, I was visiting a client of mine, and for all intent, he's like, there's no nice way to put this, but basically the mother was a crack whore. And the kids are just sitting there eating their, Captain Jack out of the box and watching TV just like, normal. So you don't find out that it's abnormal until you grow up and find out, like there's people that had actually 2 parents and a house with a fence around it, like Leave It to Beaver, like that really exists. I always thought that was Hollywood. I had no idea it was real.
But your mother just, was it because of race that she did?
Yeah, it was because of race. Well, it was a combination of things. For me, it was race. With my brother, it was just, he was older, the complications of being a single woman, an unmarried mother in the United States in the 50s was a shameful thing by itself. An unmarried white woman with a mixed race child in the United States was another level of shame. As one of my mother's relatives once put it, she must have fallen off the ends of the earth in order to end up with your father. Then, she had another child who ultimately she put up for adoption with a guy that she met. She wanted to be an actor, so she was moving in Hollywood circles. And, the reason that none of us in those days, that nobody's parents wanted them to be in show business was because show business people were quite loose. And so my mom was one of those people. And, she had this relationship with the guy, for like a month, ended up pregnant. No, abortion is illegal. Although she did have a couple of abortions, but at that point, their thing to me was always birth control doesn't work. It was enough to just scare me off of sex altogether. It was like, birth control doesn't always work. I got pregnant 5 times using birth control. I was like, holy crap, okay. So, she just temperamentally, I don't think, was cut out. Some women, just because you can be a mother doesn't mean you should be. And she had enough sense to know that she was not going to be a good mother for any of us. Yes. And all of us actually turned out okay. My brother is a professor emeritus at the University of Minnesota. The sister who was adopted, who she found us actually after I did this documentary, aforementioned documentary. She found us afterwards, and she's an English as a second language teacher for the LA County District School System. And I am a professor at Columbia University, so we didn't turn out so bad.
In journalism, right?
In journalism,
yes.
Yeah.
What was school like for you growing up?
So initially I went to an all-black elementary school, Indiana Avenue School in Atlantic City. I always laugh because I ended up through a fluke. A fluke and the timing of affirmative action. I ended up going to Harvard College, and most of the family had gone to Howard, so to go to Harvard was like this whole other thing. The black family that raised me, that I now call which is my chosen family. I now know this word. So anyway, my Harvard classmates all sort of like, we all went to private schools and whatever, and I remember getting to Harvard and I didn't know really what a boarding school was. And I felt very sorry for my classmates who said they had gone to boarding school, because my frame of reference was like Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist. And I'm thinking, wow, their parents didn't love them. They sent them away to boarding school. And I was like, Choate, like these places I'd never heard of them, Choate, Exeter. It wasn't that I hadn't been exposed, I just had never heard of them. And I was well educated. My elementary school was all black, was a segregated black school. The extended family that I was exposed to through Aunt Peggy and Uncle Paul had been extremely well educated. They all were Harvard, a lot of Harvard graduates in that crowd. And, so I had exposure to this whole other world, And then when I would visit my mother, she would expose me to another world. So I had exposure to like an all-black world, black educated elite world, and then sort of white Hollywood show business, all at the same time. So I'm integrating all this stuff while I'm growing up, or trying to.
How often would you see your mother?
Oh, I say at least once a month. Usually at least once a month, yeah.
Lots to integrate.
Yeah.
But school in general through high school, everything was segregated schools.
Atlantic City High School, by the time I got there, was integrated. And actually, apparently had integrated some time before. But, when I get to high school, it's 1967, so the entire country is sort of going through. I'm growing up as the civil rights movement is going on. So by the time I got there, we were sort of self-segregating, but we lived in there was a group of my classmates who were mostly we have this tracking system in the United States that I hate, but, so there's like college track, business track, and vocational ed track, So vocational ed, majority black, business track, mixed, college track, mostly white with some black folks, so I was in the college track. but it was also a time when, you know, sort of we were, I don't know, it was sort of like an all power to the faith. We were more integrated, I think, than, at least that's my memory of it, that it was a more integrated setting, certainly than I found when I got to Harvard, that's for sure. Yeah.
So growing up with this
Mm-hmm.
family that adopted you, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
you were living in a segregated
Mm-hmm.
community.
Mm-hmm.
And what was that like for you?
Oh, it was awesome. Atlantic City in those days. Atlantic City, the black neighborhood in Atlantic City, we had on my block a numbers runner, a person who owned a funeral parlor, a barbershop. There was an Italian guy who owned a grocery store. And then there was Mrs. Snowden's, who was the community, like where we went to get candy and stuff on the corner. Aunt Peggy was a teacher. She taught second grade elementary school. Uncle Paul was a cab driver, and he worked for the county. There was a seamstress, Ms. McKee, on the corner. The very first story I wrote as a journalist was about a guy named Reverend Eli Samuels, who built by hand the AME church that was next door to us. That church is still there. The house, I literally just saw it on Saturday. The house where I grew up is gone. It's just a lot with you can see the cement walkway that led to the stairways, but that church is still there. So it was a really mixed community, and we could see the difference. You were able to see the difference between how, like, the children of the number runner was treated versus the children. There was also a doctor around the corner, you know. So we had a sort of as children, we could observe how people referred to and talked about, how the adults talked about folks in a way that allowed us to sort of make comparisons on our own, which I don't think exists anymore, because like the classes now are so separated, but because it was sort of enforced segregation, you had people who were well-to-do living next to people who had nothing, you know, and it was much different. And Atlantic City was so small anyway. I mean, you know, it was a stable, in those days, a stable population of about 60,000. And I realized how small it was. I realized how small it was. Now that I live in New York, now that I've sort of traveled everywhere, you know, you go back home again, it's like, oh my God, this really was a small town, you know, where people really had nothing to do except talk about each other on the phone all day.
So it was a very nice community.
That's my memory of it.
Very supportive, very...
Yeah. The teachers cared. Certainly in elementary school, the teachers really cared about getting us an education. And also about knowing our Black history. So I was introduced to Black history, I want to say in fourth grade, third or fourth grade. Somebody in the class made a joke about Tarzan. And everybody wanting to be, I'm just talking, it was Tarzan and the Apes, or I don't even, I wrote about this in my book, and I now can't remember exactly how it unfolded because I've forgotten the interviews, but it was Mrs. Cotton's class, fourth grade. You know, and she heard us joking about Africans, and she literally slammed her hand down on the desk, and basically threw out the entire curriculum, and for the next couple of weeks, she pulled out she had these old copies of Carter G. Woodson's African Americans in History. So Carter G. Woodson is, you know, the first scholar who really, he invented Black History Week, which then became Black History Month, but initially it was just a week. You know, she pulled out these books and like literally she just like stopped all curriculum, and she was like, you people are gonna learn, you children are going to learn where you come from. And the teachers really enforced that, you know. And when I got to, for junior high, they put me in a Quaker school because the feeling was I wasn't focused enough. So they put me in a Friends school. And I remember first day of school, they asked us to go around the room and introduce ourselves by telling who are our role models. And I said, my role model was Mary McLeod Bethune, who has like a resume that's too long to even start here. We'll be here for 2 hours. And my teacher didn't, like who? You know, and I was like, Mary McLeod Bethune. She was Eleanor Roosevelt's best friend. You know, and then she was like, oh, yeah, you know, and then it was like it sort of triggered something, but, you know, and I had that experience often as I was growing up, not just at Friends, but even when I got to the high school at Atlantic City High. My white teachers often wouldn't understand the frames of reference, but because we'd been so well grounded, not only at Indiana Avenue School, but through the family, the Gregory family, which basically adopted me, you know, we had a really strong foundation in who we were as a people, not just who we were as a family.
And so when you would go to visit your mother, what was that?
It's compartmentalization. Yeah, which I still do. It's sort of funny how those ingrained. Like today, I have a whole schedule that I have an alternate life scheduled for today in New York while I'm here in DC. And I had to spend most of last night and part of this morning undoing the schedule in New York because I had office hours, my students were coming to see me, I was going to have some stuff removed from my stepdad's apartment. Oh my God, it was crazy. Anyway, I have powers of compartmentalization second only to Bill Clinton, is what has been my joke about it. But yeah, I just didn't really, I wasn't encouraged to talk about it. I was actively discouraged from talking about Norma and Larry. So when I was 9, my mother did finally find a guy who married her who was an actor and comedian named Larry Storch. And so when she married him, then it became a different sort of, from a general, people will be upset because I have this mixed race, to Larry's career will suffer if people know I have this mixed race child. Because at that point, you can't even imagine it. Black people weren't even on TV. Black people were not allowed to play basketball. Black people were not on, you know, you did not, when people, it was so odd to see a black person on television that we would literally have a phone tree. Like calling each other is like, there's black people on the Ed Sullivan Show, you know, or, you know, there's a black person on, you know, whatever, I Dream of Jeannie or whatever it was, you know, it was just a really rare, it's almost impossible now to try to imagine, to rewind and imagine what that was like. So on my mother's part, it was this fear that Larry's career would be hurt. On Peggy and Uncle Paul's part, it was reinforced by economics. I mean, they were getting a monthly, sort of the equivalent of child support, a monthly stipend. My mother would send them money every month. The money was paying for piano lessons, dance classes, day camp, the private school, you know, and so, you know, Peggy was like, all this disappears if you talk about this to your friends, so don't. So I had a very few, like trusted, like maybe 5 of my best friends who sort of knew, but I didn't really talk about it. And, you know, we all knew that we weren't supposed to talk about it. Who knew? And then everybody else, I just, you know, on Peggy and Uncle Paul, for all intent and purposes, were my mother and father, and, you know, my cousins, and, you know, were the family that had embraced me and was adopting me. And for a long time, their grandparents were my grandparents, and I called them Mom and Pop, just like everyone else did.
So as you went through middle school and high school, I mean, was elementary school mostly black teachers? I'm wondering.
There was one white teacher in the entire school.
In elementary school, okay. One white. And then in middle school or junior high?
And then in middle school, it was all white teachers. And then in high school, it was mixed. They had started, when Brown v. Board was passed, they started integration at the high school level, and they started by taking the best teachers from the elementary school and putting them in the high school. And so the best teachers had gone over first. The best black teachers had gone over first. So there were some black teachers in the high school, and I had I don't know, 4 or 5 black teachers, and I'm trying to remember, because, you know, high school is so different because you have homeroom, and then, you know, so I don't remember all of it, you know.
Okay, so I see. I was just trying to see
Yeah.
how it changes as you go
Yeah.
higher in K through 12 education. and you were within that community that you described throughout this whole
Mm-hmm.
period, right?
Yeah.
And then when you finished high school, what did you decide to do?
Well, college was always on the table. I think my first choice might have been Rutgers at the time, or Douglas, which was the women's school. It's associated. And then one day somebody knocked on my door, and it was the grandson of a woman who lived around the corner, next door to the Gregories, actually, on Ohio Avenue. And he said, I'm a student at Harvard University, and your name is on a list of promising students that might be interested in applying to Harvard. And I literally laughed until I cried. No, it was a black man. It was a young black man who was then, I guess, either a freshman or a sophomore. Jim Henderson was his name.
Furthermore, the community looking out for.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Harvard, I don't know where Harvard got the list from, but I guess from the guidance counselor or somewhere.
Okay,
And then they were
Yeah.
using,
Sending people around to.
they had black students going to recruit other black
Yes.
students. So, you know, he knocked on my door, and he can laugh about it to this. We still laugh about it because he said, I literally doubled over in tears and just like couldn't even stand up. I'm just like, you must be out of your mind. No, me? Harvard? No. No, I don't know. You need to go knock on somebody else's door, you know. And it took him quite a while to persuade me, and then it took my guidance counselor longer to persuade me. I think Syracuse might have been like, I was thinking like my aim for the sky was Syracuse. I wanted to study. I knew I wanted to be a journalist even then. We'd had some guy came to one of those study auditorium things that you have to sit through when you're in junior high. And they were like uniformly boring, and we would all try to sleep. But this one guy came from the Philadelphia Inquirer, was a reporter, and he said two things that caught my attention immediately. And the first was reporters, that my job as a reporter is to go around asking people questions that are none of my business. And the second was I have this credit card that the company gives me, and I use it to travel all over the world. So I was like, sign me up. In the first place, I was one of those children that was forever asking questions that people would say, you'll know when you're older. I think as part of my effort to try to integrate this, I was always asking the adults some kind of question, and they would say, this is not for children to know, or is this for adults to know and children to find out later. It was always some variation. It used to drive me up a wall. I never do that to young people now. Just like assume that children are as smart as I am. They're just trying to figure it out, you know. But in those days, it was very much a, you know, children are to be seen and not heard.
So then what happened? Did you decide on?
So I applied to Harvard. I applied to like 6 schools. I think my first choice actually my first choice was Bennington or Swarthmore. I got into Bennington, but they didn't offer me any money. I was waitlisted at Swarthmore, and then Harvard let me in with a full ride and a work study thing. Work study, so full ride scholarship plus work study money. So basically a stipend and and a scholarship. And I wasn't sure I wanted to go to Harvard. You know, it's like I didn't know anything about Harvard. I sort of heard John Kennedy went to Harvard. That's all I knew about Harvard. Yeah, John Kennedy went to Harvard. And I was like, I don't know, it's awfully big, and you know, I don't know, you know. And you know, my family was like, "Are you out of your freaking mind? You're gonna turn down Harvard?" Nowadays people do, but I've often wondered what would have happened had I not.
And
Not
how
done
was
that.
Harvard?
Traumatic. It took me 20 years to get over it. There was a period of time when I literally could not go to Harvard Square. Like, if I was in Harvard Square, I had to leave. I had to, like, physically leave. It was just traumatic. It wasn't that I didn't do well there. It was just a constant trauma, a constant sense of feeling erased, not feeling as good as. I mean, you know, like my classmates have a whole other experience there, but for me, I was sexually assaulted twice. So I think that was part of it. I was trying to deal, you know, then all of the stuff around my family had started to come up. It was just a lot I was trying to deal with, and no real way to, I didn't have any language to talk about it. Women didn't have a language to talk, we didn't have women's rights. There was no language for that. There was, we were beginning to have a Black Power movement. We had a Black Power movement. We were the last.
I'm sorry, could we stay with the women not having a
Sure.
language? I think this is really important, especially for younger generations.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, even within the Black Panther Party, I think it was Huey or H. Rep. No, it was Kathleen Cleaver's husband, Cleaver.
It'll come.
Kathleen Cleaver's husband, whose last name is Cleaver, whose name I'm having a trouble with right now, said, what is the best position for women in the movement? Prone. And that was basically, where women, like you could support your man by doing what your man wanted you to do. There was no language for empowerment of women at all. There was no language for
This is both
harassment.
We're talking about the Black community.
This was, the white women's movement hasn't even started yet. It doesn't start until around 72 or 73.
Right.
So, the Black Power movement Black Power movement is really what fueled everything moving. So we'd had, the Civil Rights movement had gotten us to the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act. Our generation thought it was going to be smooth sailing. We had no idea that, we would still be talking about this stuff in the year 2022, that we're still talking about police brutality. Really? We thought that those legislative acts would make it disappear. And in the late 70s, we began to get, I'm out of college now, but we're beginning to get this sense that, no, this is going to be a long struggle. And we didn't and now I really am quoting Kathleen Cleaver, who I've interviewed a couple of times. And one of the things that Kathleen says is, as young people, as engaged in the struggle for liberation, we didn't understand the level of persistence it was going to take. We didn't understand the spiritual component that would be required. We discounted the role of the church in the movement. We just didn't understand. We thought that if we just got angry enough and spoke loudly enough and forcefully enough, that we would prevail. And we just didn't get it. We didn't get the length of time it takes to actually make real change in a society. And at that point, we didn't even, even Kathleen, will talk about, just sort of just accepting that position, even though she was this sort of like fiery, beautiful, power to the people person. Here she has, she's putting up with a lot behind the scenes.
So Harvard, this was one aspect of it.
Yes.
Can you speak about others? I mean,
So academically, there was, oh God, this is hard to get into. So there was a guy named, let me see, where can I start? There was a guy named Martin Kilson, who was one of the first Black professors at Harvard, had actually been a mentor to one of my older cousins, had mentored a lot of Black men who had gone through Harvard, but oh God, among the Black women, the word was, do not go to Martin Kilson's office alone. And I never did. And at some point I got into a public debate with him. He said that Harvard was lowering its standards to admit Black students for an affirmative action goal. By which the assumption was that people like me who had gone to public school, who hadn't gone to Exeter and Choate, were somehow not as ready, not able, even though we might have the smarts, we weren't as prepared to deal with a Harvard education. And I took him on in the pages of the school newspaper. I remember I wrote this long screed. And he wrote me back and he said, "You're too smart to write something so stupid." And we never really settled. So there was that, there's this huge debate. Kilson had written this, Kilson wrote a front page in the New York Times Sunday magazine, a front page article on how affirmative action was actually harming the black community because we were admitting these students who weren't prepared. So there's that aspect. I was an English major, and I had a professor who was Brahmin, Indian, who was very hurtful. I remember one day, she asked me one day about the concept of Epiphany. And I knew about the Christian holiday Epiphany, but I wasn't familiar with in literature when we talk about Epiphany that we're talking about a real, this realization that you arrive at. I'd never heard this word. And so when she used the word, I said, are you talking about January 6th? And then she stormed out of the room, and I heard her going down the hall to be like, why are we admitting these students who aren't prepared to come here, and this child has no understanding of, I don't know. She went on and on. I don't know her name. May she forever have a very hard life. Because she totally sort of destroyed my sense of self, my sense of ego. I also was I knew I wanted to be a journalist. I had written for the Atlantic City Press while in high school. And then I was trying to get on a student paper at Harvard. And at Harvard, so you have to, there's a competition to get on the student paper. And it lasts a semester. So you go, like, say, fall semester, you start in September, and then, you get to December. And then the people who are already on the paper, it's like a social status. They meet and they decide whether or not your stories are good enough to warrant you being elected to the Crimson. 4 times I went through this process. So all of my freshman year and sophomore year, I was trying to get on the Crimson. And I was covering the effort to begin an Afro-American Studies department at Harvard. That was the beat I was chosen. But I chose to report on it from within the conversation among the black students and among black faculty. So Lonnie Guinier, who many years later would be nominated to be the Attorney General by Bill Clinton, her father was then the chair of the Afro-American Studies Department. So I spent a lot of time getting to know Uric Guinier and his family, and Lonnie and her sister, sorry, I sort of know the whole family. And then the last time I thought I was going, so anyway, I'm writing these stories. So editorially on a newspaper, the length of a story, how much prominence it's going to be given, where it's going to go, all that is decided by the editors. So of course, this being Afro-American Studies, it had a lesser priority. So I think that was one aspect of it. I think another aspect was that I really was, by virtue of all the other things that I'm talking about, diffident and not really assertive enough as a reporter. It's the one thing I tell my students now. It's always the first thing. Like, stop being so nice. Stop being so nice. So anyway, the last time I got cut, they said the general manager of the paper, who was, I don't know, a senior himself, said to me, you need to find something else to do because you just don't have what it takes to be a reporter. That statement fueled the next 25 years of my career. And the day that I walked into the CBS Evening News as a producer for Dan Rather, I said, take that. I don't have what it takes. Take that. And, I won't name the person, but he did not continue in the news business. So yeah. So anyway, for all of those reasons, it wasn't a happy time for me.
It wasn't a happy time, but you did not stop persisting.
Well, I knew I wanted to be a reporter. Yeah. I knew I wanted to work in journalism. And again, I went back to the black community. So I was able to get the work study. Remember, I said they had given me work study money. So the work study job that I got was at the local PBS station, working for a local public affairs show, which is now called Basic Black, was then called Say Brother. Say Brother is the oldest black community affairs show in the United States. It's been running continuously since 1968. And I worked there as a production assistant. And then I was a work study student, but they didn't have any money for a PA, so I just worked there all the time. I was so happy to be there. I was so happy to be somewhere where people valued my contribution, thought I was smart, could see that I had potential, were willing to feed that potential, like all of that, you know, which the black community has historically, or did historically do. You know, and it just felt like such a blessing. I remember I just ran across, actually, the other day, a thing from Harvard on my senior year. I had one independent study credit left, and I designed, and for one credit left in my senior year that I could choose what I wanted to do. And you got a quarter credit for an independent study. And so I designed 4 courses, each of which involved my working at WGBH. So that I was able to basically spend like 24 hours a week there as opposed to 10, which allowed me to graduate, but also allowed me to stay in this environment where I was valued as opposed to feeling not valued. And as a result of that, a year after, I got an internship at the Boston Globe when I got out, and then shortly thereafter, I don't know, maybe a year later, I got a call from somebody else at WGBH and invited me back for a full-time job, and that began my career in television. So, I practice Buddhism. So, we have this thing in Buddhism. It's a concept we call changing poison into medicine. So, in a way, I changed that poison of feeling undervalued into the medicine that allowed me to start a career, which I've now had longer than I care to think about.
But it's interesting that even your reference to going to the black community or a connection to the black community, which helped you get through the hardships of Harvard.
Yeah, and around that same time, the National Association of Black Journalists had begun. There were like maybe 20 journalists. I want to say it might have been fewer, it might have been 15. Journalists who worked for some of the major mainstream papers around the country at the time, who got together and were the founders of the National Association for Black Journalists. And there was a guy one of them was a man named Louis Overby, who I knew from Boston. He worked for the Christian Science Monitor. I was then working as a stringer for the Bay State Banner. Actually, I finally got hired by the Bay State Banner. So I was the reporter for another black community newspaper called the Bay State Banner. This is after I graduated.
Where was this?
In Boston. So I was covering Roxbury.
Okay.
So Louis had been reading my reporting for the Bay State Banner. He worked for the Christian Science Monitor. He introduced me to all of these guys that were working for the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, Asilmore, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Chicago Defense. I just met, he kept, they were lifting me up. And, we, in those days, during the NAACP conventions and the Urban League conventions, all of the black reporters who were covering those conventions, we would all get together. So Louis introduced me around. He's like, we need to help this young sister. She's got talent. And they would, a man named Thomas Johnson from the New York Times took me under wing. He had been the Africa correspondent for the New York Times. He took me under wing. He would take me with him when he did interviews with people like Vernon Jordan and Jesse Jackson, who were then, up and coming themselves. So we would sit through I'd sit through the interviews, and then we'd leave. He'd say, okay, so what's the lead? What are the quotes you remember? How would you write the story? What do you think the story? And then we would all, as a group of reporters, get together and have the same conversation. So this is sort of how I teach now. It was the same process. But again, without that black community, I would have been lost,
So that becomes throughout your life, really, it's been a major support system
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah.
So going back to your mother and now your stepfather, who is the actor, right? How was that addition to the family?
There was like a Berlin Wall. I can't explain it any other way. So up until I'm 45 years old, there's a Berlin Wall between my career and my life, sort of.
Meaning career is going well.
Career is going well. I'm working as a reporter. I got a job for the PBS. It was the McNeil era report, but now it's the PBS NewsHour. I'm sorry. Can I just blow my nose real quick? And I'm still visiting Larry and Norma. Thank you. Sorry, sorry, Mr. Audio. I have allergies and they're reemerging. I'm working for the PBS NewsHour. I went from the PBS NewsHour. I covered the labor. I covered urban and regional affairs at the NewsHour, the labor beat, the Middle East, U.S.-Soviet relations, arms control, the Pentagon. So those were like the 6 beats. And my mentor there was Charlene Hunter-Gall, who got me the job through because Charlene had been at the New York Times with Thomas Johnson. She knew I was interested in TV. You know, she was like, you know, I applied for, there was this thing called the Michelle Clark Fellowship for a minute that the Ford Foundation had that I applied for that was aimed at picking up promising young people and pulling them through, and I applied for it. And Charlene told me afterwards, I argued against you because you were going to make it with or without this fellowship. And this fellowship is for people that really need help. Yeah, and I wasn't feeling like I was going to make it with or without the fellowship. And I was like, gee, thanks a lot. But then, you know, like sometime later, she called me and she was like, you know, our black reporter, this was in the day, right? Our black reporter is leaving. And they'll be looking for another black reporter. Would you like to apply for the job? Do not tell them that I told you. You know, so that was really the way the network worked. And she housed me when I got the job, you know, and I ended up in New York. I stayed at her house. I mean, she housed me for free for, you know, several months while I was trying to find a place to live and helped me figure out how to, you know, get everything straight. So, Larry and Norma. So, what do I do? So career is going great. I don't know, I think we're in the Reagan era. So my mother voted for Ronald Reagan in 1980, and there began, like 4 years I did not talk to her. So before there was Trump, there was Reagan, right? You know, it was the beginning of that sort of schism. Larry, her husband, had been a lifelong Democrat, marched in the Labor Day parade. They didn't argue about politics, they just didn't talk about politics, and he still marched in the Labor Day parade. Ronald Reagan had screwed basically all of the actors in Hollywood when he gave away the residual rights for VHSs and DVDs and stuff. When Ronald Reagan was president of the Screen Actors Guild, he signed away the rights of actors to receive residuals on any copies of any of the shows they'd ever done in exchange for the support of the Hollywood industry to become governor of California, which then launches him to become president. So, you know, I'm just like, based on that alone, Mom, what the hell? You know, and she was like, but he's such a nice guy. I'm like, no, nice guy, no, you know. Anyway, so I don't know how to answer this question of what, you know, how I just kept there was a wall, you know, I would cross the wall and I'd be with Larry and Norma, and then I'd come back and I was living my life, and, you know, and that's sort of the way it went.
Yes, okay. No, I was just
up until the time I was 45.
What happened at
A couple of things happened. Well, when I was at CBS, so I'm thinking to myself, I'm working at CBS News. I'm a producer for Dan Rather, right? If there's a time that that I can stop saying I was either Aunt Norma or, when I got older, this is my friend June. So she introduces me to somebody as my friend June, and I'm working at CBS News at this point, and I'm just like, excuse my French, what the fuck? You know, at what point, and I realized that there actually is no point when you're a black person in America, there is no point at which you're good enough to be introduced as the daughter of your mother, even when you are the producer for one of the premier news broadcasts in the United States. So I think at that point, something began to shift at that point with me and thinking about how do I relate to her, how much longer am I going to carry this secret? And then I got this job at Frontline at PBS, which is the documentary series, that long-running documentary series. And my boss, David Fanning, and I were working on a story one day that involved Berkeley High School. It was called School Colors. And there was a character in it who was biracial, who just grated on my nerves. First of all, because she insisted on being called biracial. And she has this moment in the film where she's applying paint to her face and she says, "Sometimes I wish I was green." And I was just like, this moment in the film, it was like somebody putting claws on a chalkboard. And David finally said, "What is it about her that drives you crazy?" And we were having drinks, I think. So I said, it was never an option for me. Like the whole idea of being able to say, first of all, to say I'm biracial. Secondly, to wish I was green. Third, I just spilled out the entire story, and his mouth sort of dropped open, as I guess yours has a couple of times during this. And he said, "Have you ever thought about doing a documentary about this?" And I was like, "Hell no." My mother would never agree to it. And he said, "Well, have you ever asked her?" I was like, "Well, why would I ask? I know what the answer is going to be. I've been living this now for, I guess it was 42 years, because it took me a while to come around." So he actually worked on me for a while to get me to tell it. David is from South Africa, so he understands well this razor blade of race that we live on and lived through. He lived through it there. And so he was really, he was always looking for another way to come at this issue of race in America. And I think around this time was the Rodney King beating and the O.J. Simpson trial. We're both they were close together with each other. And so finally I said, well, I'm willing to think about doing a story on like biracial children. I talked to Leroy Jones, Mary Baraka's story. Leroy Jones, her name is Lisa Jones. Lisa and Kelly Jones are Mary Baraka's children by his first wife, Nellie Jones, and they used the last name Jones. And he literally divorced their mother and married a black woman because he thought it was counter-revolutionary to be married to a white woman. So like left the entire family, married a black woman who gave him sons for what she was, so then you talk to the daughters, you talk to Lisa and Kelly, who are actually, Kelly's now a colleague of mine. I don't even know how she'll feel about me talking about this, but anyway, if you talk to them now, it was like, well, not only was it that he left us because our mother was white, it was that he valued his sons more than he valued his daughters. So I don't know what happens to this, so I may need to, whatever. So I was trying to get them to agree, because that was the closest, their story, their mother had been disowned by her family when she married Mary Baraka. And their story most closely paralleled my story of all of the people that I sort of knew that were in our situation. And but then they decided they didn't want to go public with it. And so I was still sort of, at one point I talked to Anna DeVere Smith about interviewing people who were passing and doing the story that way, and David kept saying, "June, when are you going to ask your mother?" And I kept trying to find, there must be some way around me asking my mother to do this. And finally, I don't know, I think finally I just came around. I decided I'd go and I'd try to do it. And yeah, it's a film called Secret Daughter, if you want to.
Very nice. So you asked her or not? You just did it?
It took me a long time. I mentioned I'm a Buddhist, so I chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. So literally for a week, I went to the Buddhist Center in Los Angeles. They were living in LA then. I went to the Buddhist Center in LA and I chanted Nam-myoho Renge Kyo for 8 hours a day for a week, at the end of which I took her out and asked her, would she be willing to do this? And she immediately said yes. She's like, "I knew you were going to ask me when you first came to LA, because I was staying with them." I told her I was doing a story on biracial children. I hadn't said that I was interested in asking her. And then through a fluke, When I actually sat her down to do the interview, I forgot to turn the mic on. So I had a 3-hour silent interview. This is all in the documentary. And then I asked her again, then I was like, we have to do this because I forgot, we have to redo it because I forgot to turn on the goddamn mic. And I'm sorry, forgive me, I'm a reporter, I don't know how to talk without cursing. Then she said no, and it took me like another 8 or 9 months to persuade her again, to get her to sit down.
So when that came out, what was the reaction? Do you
Oh
know
boy, from her or from the world?
From both.
Well, she first complicated, but she loved it.
Okay.
My mother had always wanted to be an actor. And actually, one of the stories she used to tell was that she had been in the actor's studio with Marlon Brando, and we all thought she was just telling tales because she was very good at that, sort of stretching the truth a little bit. Then when she died, lo and behold, here's a thing here's a program from the actor's studio, and Norma Booth on stage with Marlon Brando. And I was like, holy shit, she actually was on stage. But she never had the self-confidence to sort of push herself. So she looked at the entire 3-hour silent interview as a prerequisite. She wanted to observe herself to see how did she come off. And she decided she was not unlikable. And then my brother, so the brother who's 14 years older than I, Larry and I are still very close. So Larry and I went to work on her. And that took weeks. And finally we persuaded her. And then when it came out, so I'm the kind of journalist that I'm not showing you the product before I do it. So I edited the entire film. It took like 6 months, I think. She hadn't seen it. And then the press began. She still hasn't seen it. She reads a press release somewhere and she's convinced that I've made her look like, Joan Crawford or something. And I was like, Mom, I promise you don't look like Joan Crawford. And then I finally sent the film to my brother because I'm still not going to let her see it before. This is like a reporter's thing. We're less strict about it now than we were then. But anyway, Larry watched the film and he called her and he said, this is one of the best pieces of film work I've ever seen. So then she relented a little, and we had both been on the Tavis Smiley. We had gone on the Tavis Smiley show that day. She cried the entire time in a limo up until the moment that we had to go on Tavis. We did the half-hour, or it was an hour show. We came off. She started crying again. She cried all night. I felt like shit. I still wasn't going to show her the film. But then when she saw it, she loved it. And of course, she really loved it when it won an Emmy. And then she was more elated than I was. I think I was in a state of shock because part of me, I couldn't figure out who else would ever be interested in this story. It was just, it felt so self-indulgent to tell the story in the first place. And then, like, who cares? And she was just jumping up and down and elated, and she was like, oh, June, I knew you could do it. I knew you could do it. And I'm looking at her like, who are you? You're the one that I had to spend a year persuading to go on camera? So anyway, she loved it. And then there was this really perverse reaction from some of her friends. So she had friends who were in Hollywood who were very liberal, who then judged her harshly for having done what she did. And then she had other friends who were very conservative who called her and apologized profusely for all the racist things she had ever said that she had repeated to me. And I now know who they are. And there are certain companies and certain people that I still have nothing to do with because I know what the deal is. So yeah, it was a...
I'm sorry, I want to make sure I understand. Who, the conservatives...
Mm-hmm. She had a friend. So one of the big issues was she had a friend who was actually a newspaper owner, a publisher, of a chain of Midwestern newspapers, small Midwestern newspapers, who was very, like, Reagan conservative. She'd probably be a Trump conservative now. Who Norma was very concerned about what they would think of her. Yeah, her, what was the saying? They would put me out like a cat with the garbage or something like that. And Larry sort of didn't care. Larry's Larry was always much more, he was easier about everything. Larry's always been easier about everything. So he sort of didn't care, and he didn't. He's like Norma cares what those people think. I don't really care what they think. But Larry had always been, Larry and my biological father were friends, very good friends, yeah. So Larry had been used to client. Larry dated Pearl Bailey for a while. There was a rumor in Hollywood that I was actually. When they would introduce me as their daughter, without any whatever, there was a rumor that I was actually Pearl Bailey's daughter with Larry, as opposed Norma. Nobody's ever thinking that's Norma's daughter with Jimmy. Well, it must be Larry's daughter with Pearl Bailey. So yeah.
Okay, and then how about the public reaction?
Oh man,
You got an Emmy. So
I won an Emmy and I think the DuPont Columbia Journalism Award for it, and I got a gold baton, which is quite a big deal. And hundreds of letters from people everywhere. I was astonished at in how many ways this story is repeated, and even now I still hear from people who are living some variation of this story. That usually does involve race in a prior relationship or a present relationship, or a friend of mine did a film. She became at Lacey Schwartz. Did a film on what was it called? Little White Lies. Her mother had an affair with her father's best friend who was black, and she was born. And they tried to pass her off as Jewish until one day when she's like 15. Her father is looking from her to the best friend, from her to the best friend, and all of a sudden puts two and two together. So this thing, it's not.
So in a sense, I mean, these letters show you how, in a sense, you supported so many other people.
Yeah.
In terms of the psychological case, and of course, it's an ongoing issue in America in relation
It's crazy.
to race, right?
I tell my international students it's like being born Muslim or Christian, and you're born into it. The idea of changing it is to bring dishonor on your family.
Exactly.
And so you never do, unless unless you're intrepid and you decide either to pass or you just say the hell with it at some point. Yeah.
This very successful journalist and of course professor, but you always there's a humility about you, but also there's this side which just doesn't believe that you're doing anything extraordinary, and yet you are.
Yeah, I know. My therapist tells me this all the time. It's like, when are you going to acknowledge that you're...
Yeah, it's interesting. You don't. Anything about that? I mean, do you know why that is?
Who knows?
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
I suspect it has something to do with the effort to compartmentalize when I was a kid. I was living this extraordinary life then, and, but...
Is there anything you would like to say? I mean, I think we're coming to the end, unless you have other things, of course, to say. But my question is, so you've lived a very full, interesting, difficult, rich, impressive life. In terms of race, what would you say for the younger generation?
Don't give up.
Okay. Don't give up. Okay.
Don't give up. And I think knowing your history is so important. I always say this to like my next door neighbors a Jewish couple adopted a black kid, and every once in a while I would see something on the internet, they'd post something on Facebook or something. I was like, please make sure that kid knows where he is from, so that when he looks in the mirror, he doesn't just see, I'm the only black face in this sea of white cousins, but I am, I come from a lineage of people, who fought. I come from a lineage of people who endured slavery and figured out how to make gospel out of it. I come from a lineage of people who were being lynched and figured out how to make jazz out of it. We are not the sum of the worst things that happen to us. We're the product of the best of our imaginations. And I think especially the last 3 years, have been so awful. That I notice among my students the sense of hopelessness. Now, granted, the questions are more existential. Is there going to be a world in 10 years at the rate we're going? Is Russia going to drop a bomb? But, was Russia going to drop a bomb? Was the question in 1960? And we've lived through worse and come out better, and we can again, but it takes involvement from the youth really to realize that they have the power to do something about it and not sit back and think there's nothing we can do because the boomers won't let us. I mean, the boomers can be outvoted,
Yes.
and we are dying off,
Yes.
so there is that. So there's always hope.
Yes.
Winter always turns to spring.
Yes, and I think you really just gave such an important summary in terms of the lynching jazz, this whole history of African Americans in this country. And I think, in fact, the reason, I'm going to just share this with you, the reason for a project like this, I think, is that these very important historical matters need to be recorded, need to be put out there for anyone from the younger generation, not just blacks. I mean, I wish mostly whites would, hear these amazing stories and the importance of understanding what this population has actually contributed to this country in so many different ways that I don't think it's yet been told, the full story,
It can't be told in one document. It's really, it takes all of us,
And I'm just saying, but there are many stories that have to be told about it.
Yeah.
Because I think from the very beginning, even before this country was a country, there's been this relationship, and it's a very important one to not lose track of. Despite all the desires among a certain group of people to try to, put it underground and get rid of it. But I really appreciate what you just said for the younger generation especially.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else you'd like to share?
I did a podcast the other last week, and somebody asked me, I was thanking Aunt Peggy, who raised me, who sort of, but also that entire larger black family, my chosen family, as I call them now, who really gave me a foundation of love and support and a sense of who I was. I wouldn't be here without them. People a lot of times say, how could you love your mother for after what she did? And first of all, my mother had the sense to know that she couldn't raise me. She had the sense to place me with a family that gave me the foundation that I needed. When I think of what I would have been had I been raised by a woman who really wanted a child who could pass for white, looking the way I look, there's no passing for white happening here. I would be one really screwed up. Would never be here. Wouldn't be at Columbia, wouldn't have done what I did, would never have had the confidence, would never have had the ability. God knows where I'd be. So I thank you, Mom, for giving me away.
And that's very fair, and that's also very forgiving of you. So I wanted to so you worked as a producer. When did you go to
Columbia? So after Secret Daughter aired, I did 96. So almost, 25 years ago, 26 years ago. Let me think. I got a book contract. But then I did like 2 or 3 more documentaries after that. I kept postponing it. A book is different than a documentary. A documentary, you see the external. The camera sees me. The camera doesn't see what I'm thinking. When I'm writing a book, I actually have to write down all those feelings. And I had to come to grips with, like, what were all those feelings, really? And that took me the better part of 10 years. And then I realized at a certain point that I couldn't continue to make documentaries and try to write the book, because making documentaries is about making relationships with other people, and I needed to really work on my relationship with me. So I went to Columbia because I got a job teaching there as a adjunct for a couple of years. And then they offered me a full-time job. I mean, the idea was I get summers and the winter off. Ha ha. Turned out not to be true, because I started a program in documentary at Columbia, which is a 52-week program, so I don't get the 3 months off in the summer. It's 51 weeks, actually.
So you started a department, a program?
Yeah, I have a program in documentary at Columbia, at the journalism school. But it's 51 weeks, so I literally have, they leave on Friday and the new group comes a week later.